A very slow beginning in an extremely quiet America in the very early days of the land that would someday be called the United States. The world moved at a pace that was slower than the slowest breeze drifting across an empty field. People lived quiet lives. There was nothing particularly exciting happening, and most things took far more time than anyone today would ever imagine. The forests were wide, stretching far beyond what the eyes could see. The rivers moved gently, as if they were not in a hurry at all, and the land, large and silent, simply existed. This was a time long before electricity, cars, machines, or anything fast. People walked everywhere. They spoke less, and they waited for the seasons to pass because there was nothing else to rush for. In this quiet land, the days blended into each other. One day looked almost exactly like the next. Sunrise followed sunrise. Sunset followed sunset. And nothing dramatic interrupted this slow rhythm of life. The first settlers arrive. Very slowly, when the first European settlers arrived, they did not come quickly. Their ships sailed across the ocean at a steady, almost sleepy pace. The waves rocked the wooden ships gently, and the long journey felt endless. When they finally reached the shores of the New World, they stepped off their ships, not with great excitement, but with a quiet, tired curiosity. They looked at the land, and the land looked back at them. There were no cheering crowds. There were no loud celebrations, just the soft sound of water touching the shore. The settlers began building small wooden houses. Each house took a long time to finish. They cut down trees, one slow swing of an axe at a time. They shaped wood piece by piece. The work was steady, repetitive, and simple. Every day felt almost the same. Wake up, cut wood, carry water, cook simple food, sleep early, repeat. Nothing changed very quickly, and the people didn't mind because life was not about rushing. Life was about surviving the day and preparing for the next one at the exact same quiet pace. A very calm colony life. As the colonies grew, towns began to form. But even those towns were quiet, peaceful, and extremely slow. There were no cars or noise, only footsteps on dirt paths and the soft voices of people speaking politely. Shops did not have bright signs. Markets did not have loud vendors. Instead, there were small wooden stalls, and people exchanged goods with calm conversation. A person might spend an entire morning buying just a few items: a loaf of bread, some salt, a handful of dried beans. The process was not rushed. The seller weighed the goods gently. The buyer waited patiently. Sometimes both stood in silence, as if thinking about nothing in particular. Even entertainment was slow. People read books slowly, told stories slowly. They listened to the wind moving through trees. They watched candles burn down. They waited for nothing, and yet everything felt complete in its own slow way. The long, slow roads travel in the early American colonies was one of the slowest activities imaginable. Roads were rough, uneven, and made of dirt. Walking from one town to another could take hours, sometimes days. And during the walk, there was almost nothing to look at except trees, fields, and the same repeating landscape. Horses moved at a gentle pace. Wagons rolled slowly, creaking softly as wooden wheels turned. Travelers felt every bump on the road, and every journey seemed longer than the one before. People accepted this slowness because they had no other choice. There was no fast way to travel. There were no shortcuts, only patience and the quiet sounds of footsteps, hooves, and wind. Early town meetings, very boring ones, one of the most characteristic events in early American towns was the meeting long. Quiet and very uneventful gatherings where people discussed everyday matters. Meetings could last for hours. People sat on wooden benches. They listened to one person speak slowly. Then another person spoke even more slowly. Everyone nodded politely. Many topics were not exciting at all. How to repair a fence, whether the well needed cleaning, when to collect more firewood, how to divide land equally. There were no arguments, no shouting, and no intense debates. Just gentle discussions, long pauses, and steady agreement. Sometimes nothing important happened in the entire meeting, but the people still attended because it was simply what they did. The very quiet farms. Most early Americans lived on farms, and farm life was extremely repetitive. Every morning looked the same. Every evening looked the same. People woke up with the sunrise, worked through the day, and slept shortly after sunset. Crops grew slowly. Farmers waited patiently for weeks, sometimes months, just watching plants grow a little bit each day. Animals moved at their own calm speed. Cows grazed. Chickens wandered. Horses rested after light work. The days passed with minimal change, and that steady routine continued through all seasons. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was simply normal. In the quiet continuation of the two-horse era, daily life moved forward with very little urgency and almost no excitement at all, as two horses pulled wagons, carts, and simple carriages across long dusty roads that stretched endlessly through small towns and open countryside, where nothing much ever happened quickly, and where people accepted slowness as a normal and unavoidable part of existence. Because during this period, speed was not expected, efficiency was not demanded, and progress arrived. Slowly, often delayed by weather-tired animals, broken wooden wheels, or the simple need to stop and rest while farmers, traders, and travelers sat silently, listening to the dull rhythm of hooves hitting the ground in a repetitive pattern that rarely changed, creating a steady, almost hypnotic sound that blended into everyday life as two horses worked side by side evenly, matched in strength and temperament, trained to respond calmly to reins and quiet commands, moving forward not with ambition, but with routine discipline, pulling loads of grain, supplies, furniture, mail, or sometimes nothing important at all, just moving because movement was required. And because staying still was rarely an option in a world that depended entirely on physical motion rather than engines or electricity. And in these moments, people had long hours to think or not think at all, staring at the road ahead, watching fences pass by slowly, counting trees, observing clouds that barely shifted their shape, while the two horses continued forward at the same unchanging pace, indifferent to human concerns, focused only on the familiar task they had repeated countless times before, day after day, year after year, without any sense of accomplishment or boredom, because animals did not question routine the way humans sometimes did. And as towns grew gradually around these slow transportation routes, nothing about the two-horse system encouraged speed or innovation, and shops opened when wagons arrived, not when clocks demanded, and letters reached their destinations whenever the horses were strong enough and the roads were passable enough, meaning delays were common and accepted without complaint. As people adjusted their expectations downward, understanding that waiting was simply part of life, and even emergencies moved slowly, because a two-horse wagon could not be rushed beyond its natural limits, and pushing animals too hard only resulted in exhaustion or injury, which made things even slower afterward. And so patience became a quiet virtue, practiced without praise or recognition, embedded deeply into the culture of communities that relied entirely on animal power. And while cities elsewhere began to imagine faster futures, the two-horse era continued its steady existence in rural regions, largely unchanged and largely unnoticed, with roads that remained uneven, muddy in the rain, and dusty in the heat, and with horses that required constant care, feeding, cleaning, and rest, adding more time and effort to every simple journey, ensuring that nothing could ever truly be quick or efficient. And as years passed, generations grew up knowing nothing else, learning to judge distance not in miles, but in hours or days, and planning travel around daylight weather conditions, and the physical limits of two patient animals, while conversations during these trips were often minimal, interrupted by long stretches of silence because there was little to talk about when nothing around you changed very much. And even when mechanical inventions slowly began to appear on the horizon, the two-horse system remained in place for a long time, not because it was better, but because it was familiar, reliable in its own slow way, and deeply woven into everyday habits, making people reluctant to abandon something that, although boring and inefficient, had carried them through countless ordinary days without drama. And so the two horses kept walking, pulling their loads without protest, passing the same fields, the same fences, and the same quiet towns, leaving behind no exciting stories, no heroic moments, only a long trail of ordinary movement that defined an era, not by greatness or speed, but by repetition, patience, and the dull persistence of slow progress that barely felt like progress at all. In the early years of American expansion, the horse continued its quiet, repetitive role without much excitement or drama. There were no heroic moments, no sudden changes, and no remarkable events that made these days memorable. Horses simply existed day after day, moving slowly across dirt roads, muddy paths, and endlessly flat landscapes. Most horses woke up early, not because they wanted to, but because humans expected them to. The morning usually began with basic routines. A farmer or traveler would approach the stable, open the wooden door, and prepare the horse for another long and ordinary day. The process was always the same. Saddles were placed. Harnesses were tightened. Nothing interesting happened during this time, and nothing unusual was expected. As transportation, horses were not fast by modern standards. They walked for long hours, often stopping for water, then continuing again at the same slow pace. The scenery rarely changed. Trees looked the same. Roads stretched forward without any visual difference. Towns were small and forgettable, consisting of a few buildings, a quiet street, and perhaps a general store that sold basic supplies. Horses pulled wagons filled with grain, wood, tools, or sometimes nothing at all. The sound of hooves hitting the ground created a dull, repetitive rhythm that filled the air. It was not loud, not quiet, just present. Travelers often became tired of listening to it, but there was no alternative sound to replace it. In many cases, journeys took days or weeks. During this time, horses ate, walked, rested, and walked again. There was no entertainment, no conversation, just the slow movement forward. At night, horses were tied to posts or simple fences, standing still under dark skies. They did not complain. They did not celebrate. They simply waited for morning. In growing American towns, horses were everywhere. Streets were filled with wagons, moving at nearly the same speed. Traffic jams existed, but they were slow and silent. Nothing happened quickly enough to feel stressful. People waited patiently because there was no reason to rush. Horses could not go faster even if someone wanted them to. Postal services also depended on horses. Letters moved slowly across long distances. A message written in one town might take weeks to arrive somewhere else. The horse carrying it had no idea what the message said, and it did not matter. The responsibility was never questioned. The horse walked, stopped, and walked again. Over time, this routine became so normal that it stopped being noticed. Horses blended into the background of daily life. They were no longer special or impressive. They were simply tools that moved things from one place to another without any emotion or excitement. As years passed, railroads slowly began to appear. Even then, horses did not disappear immediately. They continued their work quietly, unaware that their importance was slowly fading. For a long time, nothing changed at all. Days remained boring. Travel remained slow. Life continued in the same predictable pattern. And so, horses remained, walking forward, step by step, carrying the weight of a nation that was growing without urgency, without speed, and without anything particularly interesting happening at all. As the years continue to move forward, very slowly and without any excitement, the world around these small historical moments changed in such a quiet way that most people did not even notice it happening. Days passed into weeks, and weeks passed into years, all without any sudden events or dramatic stories worth remembering. Life, for most people, remained simple, repetitive, and extremely predictable. In small towns and villages, people woke up early in the morning, usually before the sun had fully risen into the sky. They performed the same daily tasks they had done for many years before. They walked the same dusty paths, used the same old tools, and spoke about the same ordinary topics that had already been discussed countless times in the past. Nothing felt new, and nothing felt urgent. Time itself felt heavy, slow, and unchanging. Horses continued to play a quiet but important role in everyday life. They were not symbols of power or speed anymore. Instead, they were simply part of the background of history, moving calmly through fields and roads without any recognition. A horse pulling a cart down a long road was not a scene worth writing about at the time. Yet, these simple moments made up the majority of real history. Inside homes, people sat quietly, often saying very little. The sound of wind outside, or the soft creaking of wooden floors, filled the silence. Even conversations were slow and uneventful. People talked about the weather, the condition of crops, or how another year had passed without anything remarkable happening. There was comfort in this boredom, even if no one ever described it that way. Government offices continued to function in an equally dull manner. Papers were written, signed, and stored away in dusty cabinets. Clerks spent long hours copying information by hand, line, day after day. Most of these documents were never read again, yet they were carefully preserved, adding to the growing weight of history that few would ever explore. Education, too, moved at a slow and steady pace. Teachers repeated the same lessons year after year, often from memory rather than books. Students listened quietly, sometimes barely paying attention, as familiar facts were spoken once again. Learning was not exciting. It was simply something that happened, one slow sentence at a time. As nights arrived, darkness covered the land gently and without drama. Lamps were lit, shadows filled the corners of rooms, and people prepared for sleep. There were no great dreams of the future, only the expectation that tomorrow would look almost exactly like today. And in most cases, it did. History books rarely focus on these moments, yet they represent the longest part of human existence. Not the wars, not the revolutions, but the endless stretches of calm, routine, and quiet repetition. This was the true rhythm of the past, slow, steady, and deeply uneventful. And as time continued its silent journey forward, these ordinary days stacked upon one another, forming the foundation of the world we now live in, even though almost no one remembers them. As time moved forward, still slowly and without any sense of urgency, nothing truly changed in the way people experienced their days. Seasons followed one another in a predictable order. Spring arrived, then quietly turned into summer, which eventually faded into autumn before winter returned once again. This pattern repeated itself year after year, so consistently that people stopped thinking about it altogether. Farms continued to operate in the same dull rhythm. Fields were plowed, seeds were planted, and crops were harvested. Not because anyone felt inspired to do so, but simply because that was how life functioned. There was no celebration when the work was finished, only a calm acceptance that it would all begin again the following year. Tools grew worn, handles became smooth from repeated use, and nothing felt new or noteworthy. Horses remained present, standing patiently in barns, or slowly pulling loads that were never heavy enough to be memorable. They waited quietly, moved when asked, and rested when the work was done. No one praised them, and no one wrote about them. They were just there, breathing softly, existing without purpose, beyond routine labor. Merchants arranged the same items on shelves that had not been rearranged in years. Customers entered, exchanged a few polite words, and left without any meaningful interaction. Prices changed very little, and when they did, people noticed but quickly forgot. Nothing about these exchanges was dramatic enough to stand out. Religious gatherings continued in an equally uneventful manner. People sat in silence, listened to familiar words, and returned home feeling neither inspired nor disappointed. These gatherings were not moments of transformation. They were simply pauses in the week, offering structure rather than meaning. Over time, even the words spoken began to blur together, blending into one long, continuous repetition. Letters were written, though rarely with urgency. Most messages contained simple updates about health, weather, or minor concerns that had already resolved themselves by the time the letter arrived. Days or weeks later, a response might come, equally uneventful and equally delayed. Communication existed, but it lacked emotion, speed, or importance. Children grew older in this slow environment without realizing it. Their days were filled with the same tasks, the same lessons, and the same expectations. Growth happened quietly, without milestones worth marking. One day, they were simply adults, repeating the exact routines they had once observed in silence. At night, the same stillness returned. The world settled into quiet darkness, interrupted only by distant sounds that carried no meaning. People lay down to sleep without thinking about the future or the past. Tomorrow was already known, and yesterday was hardly worth remembering. Years passed this way, stacking gently upon one another, creating long stretches of time where nothing significant happened. History moved forward, but it did so without announcement, without direction, and without any sense of purpose. This was not the history of heroes or events. It was the history of ordinary existence, slow enough to be almost invisible. And so, life continued, calm, repetitive, and endlessly boring, forming the unnoticed foundation upon which everything else would eventually stand. As time moved forward in the same unhurried manner, the pattern of ordinary life remained mostly unchanged. One year blended into the next so smoothly that it became difficult for anyone to remember where one ended and another began. Calendars were turned, seasons repeated themselves, and people adjusted without giving much thought to the passing of time. Nothing demanded attention, and nothing interrupted the steady flow of uneventful days. Farms continued to operate exactly as they always had. Fields were planted, harvested, and left to rest, following rhythms older than memory itself. The work was slow and physical, requiring patience more than skill. Farmers rose with the sun, paused briefly at midday and returned home by evening with tired bodies and quiet minds. There was little variation, and any small change felt unnecessary to mention. In marketplaces, activity was calm and predictable. The same sellers stood in the same spots, offering the same goods to the same familiar faces. Prices changed only slightly, if at all. Conversations were short and practical, focused on basic needs rather than ideas or ambitions. Once purchases were made, people returned home, carrying not only their goods, but also the comfort of routine. Travel was rare and unremarkable. When people did move from one place to another, it was usually for practical reasons rather than curiosity. Roads were long and empty, and journeys took time without offering excitement. Travelers observed the same landscapes for hours, sometimes days, with very little to distinguish one stretch of land from another. Even movement itself felt slow and repetitive. Religious gatherings followed the same structure week after week. The same words were spoken, the same rituals performed, and the same silences observed. People attended out of habit rather than expectation. Faith, like everything else, was steady and uneventful, offering reassurance instead of inspiration. Nothing surprising occurred, and nothing was expected to. Even moments that could have been emotional passed quietly. Births, marriages, and even deaths were accepted as natural parts of life, acknowledged briefly, and then absorbed into the ongoing routine. At night, the world settled into stillness once again. People lay down to sleep without thinking much about the future or the past. There was no urgency to plan ahead because tomorrow promised nothing different from today. And so, these calm and forgettable days continued to accumulate, forming long stretches of history that lacked drama or distinction. They were not remembered individually, yet together they shaped societies, traditions, and ways of life. This quiet continuity, unnoticed and uncelebrated, was the true substance of history. Slow, repetitive, and endlessly ordinary. As those ordinary days continued to gather one on top of another, life showed no desire to become more interesting or more memorable. Each morning arrived quietly, without announcements or surprises, and each evening ended in the same soft, predictable way. People rarely marked the passing of time unless they were forced to, perhaps by a calendar hanging loosely on a wall, or by the slow wearing down of familiar objects. The land did not demand excitement, only patience. Roads slowly collected footprints, wheel marks, and dust. Yet, no one noticed these small details forming over time. Travelers moved at an unhurried pace, stopping when they were tired and continuing when they felt ready. Journeys were long, quiet, and mostly forgettable. Markets opened and closed on schedule. Goods were placed on tables, examined, purchased, and carried away. The same items appeared again and again: grain, cloth, tools, simple household objects. Bargaining was calm and familiar, without passion or urgency. Even disagreements faded quickly, as there was nothing important enough to argue about for very long. Inside workshops, craftsmen worked slowly, shaping wood, metal, or leather with steady hands. There was no rush to finish. Quality mattered more than speed, and time was always available. The sounds of quiet hammering or careful cutting blended into the background of daily life, unnoticed by those who heard them every day. News traveled slowly, and when it arrived, it was already old and unimportant. Life went on regardless of what was written on paper. At night, silence became heavier. The sky remained the same, stars appearing where they always had. People looked up without wonder, already familiar with the view. Sleep arrived gradually, not as an escape, but as another routine activity. Dreams, if they came at all, were quiet and easily forgotten by morning. Generations passed in this way, blending together until individual lives became difficult to separate from one another. What remained was not drama or greatness, but continuity, the slow, uninterrupted flow of ordinary existence. This unremarkable passage of time did not feel important then, and it still does not attract attention now. Yet it carried humanity forward more reliably than any great event ever could. The world was built not on moments of excitement, but on endless days that felt exactly like this: calm, repetitive, and almost entirely unnoticed. And so time continued, without pause and without interest, moving steadily forward, carrying these quiet lives along with it, never asking to be remembered and never expecting to be. As time moved forward in the same quiet and uneventful manner, nothing truly changed, and that was exactly how people expected it to be. Seasons followed one another without surprise. Spring arrived softly, bringing the same familiar smells of damp soil and early flowers. Summer followed with long, slow days, where the heat pressed gently against everything, making movement feel unnecessary. Autumn came with its muted colors and falling leaves, and winter returned with cold mornings and early nights. Each season felt like a repetition of the one before it, slightly different, but never interesting enough to remember. In the fields, farmers continued their work without any sense of urgency or ambition. They planted crops because planting had always been done. They harvested when the time came, not because it felt important, but because it was expected. The land gave what it gave, and people accepted it without complaint or celebration. There were no great hopes for improvement, only the quiet wish that things would remain stable and familiar. Markets opened and closed in the same way every day. Stalls were set up slowly, goods were arranged carefully, and buyers walked through without excitement. Small exchanges of money and goods took place, followed by long pauses where nothing happened at all. The sounds of the market were soft and repetitive, blending into the background of daily life until they became almost invisible. Children grew up in this steady world without realizing how slow it truly was. They learned routines before they learned dreams. They watched adults repeat the same actions and naturally assumed that this was how life was meant to be lived. There was no rush to become anything special, only the gradual movement toward becoming exactly like the generation before them. Even important moments passed quietly. Births happened, lives began, and no great announcements were made. Deaths occurred as well, gently and without drama. People gathered, spoke softly, and then returned to their routines soon after. Grief existed, but it was calm and controlled, fitting neatly into the rhythm of everyday life. At night, the world settled into silence once again. The sky remained unchanged, stars appearing in the same positions they had always occupied. People lay down to sleep, not thinking about the past or the future, but simply allowing another day to fade away. Tomorrow would come, slow and familiar, just like every day before it. And so the years continued, stacking quietly on top of one another. No single moment stood out. No single day demanded attention. This was history in its most honest form. Not loud or dramatic, but steady, dull, and endlessly repetitive. Moving forward without ever asking to be noticed. And so life continued in this almost imperceptible rhythm, each day blending into the next with a gentle sameness that left little room for surprise or excitement. Children grew up learning the same lessons their parents had learned, using the same simple tools, playing the same games, and listening to the same quiet stories about their ancestors. Even celebrations, which might have once been lively, were now subdued, following the same patterns and rituals that had been established long ago. The joy in these events was modest, more about continuity than about novelty or passion. Horses remained central to these quiet lives, trotting steadily along worn paths as people carried goods, water, and messages from place to place. Their presence was reliable, almost comforting, a steady heartbeat in an otherwise uneventful world. People did not write songs or poems about them. They simply existed as companions and helpers, quietly supporting the everyday tasks that kept villages and towns functioning. A cart creaking over a dirt road, a horse snorting in the morning mist, or a plow turning soil slowly. These were the moments that truly defined daily life, though history largely ignored them. In the evenings, families gathered around small fires or lamps, speaking in hushed tones about the mundane details of their day. Stories were often repetitive, passed down with little variation from one generation to the next. And yet, there was a certain peace in the repetition. There were no great crises to disturb life, no unexpected tragedies to break the calm. People could rely on the predictability of the world, even if it meant living lives that were quietly unremarkable. The natural world continued its steady march alongside human life. Seasons changed, fields ripened, and rivers flowed in the same predictable patterns year after year. People observed these cycles with quiet attention, adjusting their routines to the subtle shifts in temperature and weather. Farmers planted and harvested, shepherds tended their flocks, and merchants carried their wares, all in a slow, measured cadence that rarely drew notice but sustained the rhythm of existence. Even in towns where officials and bureaucrats worked, the pace remained deliberate and slow. Meetings were conducted with polite restraint, documents were filed with care, and decisions were made gradually, as if time itself were an essential component in the process. Ambition was tempered by habit. Innovation was rare because the world itself seemed content to continue without disruption. Life was safe, predictable, and monotonous. Yet this very monotony created a quiet security that few could fully appreciate. And so, as night fell once more over fields, roads, and quiet towns, the world settled into its slow and steady routine. People slept with the certainty that tomorrow would mirror today, that the horses would trot along familiar paths, that children would repeat the same lessons, and that life would continue without sudden drama. In this unremarkable, unhurried existence, the true story of human endurance unfolded, a story of ordinary days, simple routines, and the quiet passage of time, stretching endlessly into the past and carrying gently into the future. And so the years continued to flow, almost imperceptibly, as if time itself were moving through thick honey. Villages remained small, towns stayed quiet, and the vast expanses of fields and forests stretched on without interruption. There were no sudden endings, no grand conclusions, only the ongoing, unbroken flow of time. And in this gentle, unhurried way, the story of ordinary human life, the story of boredom, routine, and quiet endurance came to its natural close. Not with fireworks or fanfare, but with the simple realization that life itself, even in its most unremarkable forms, carries on, leaving behind a history that is not celebrated, not written in books, but quietly present in every step, every sound, and every slow passing day. The end.